The alley curved like an arm drawn in for an embrace, and in the last house at the very top, beneath a roof scaled like a lizard's back, Hypert opened a window for the first time. What did he see? What did he see? Gardens, endless, far-flung gardens brimming with almond blossoms, where green paths meandered and vanished into mystery, and little houses, palaces like the ones found only in fairy tales, and towers as if carved from turquoise, so close, so dazzling, so unreal. He closed his eyes and it was like a dream, then opened them again. Opposite him, a Baroque house steeped in the golden light of evening. At one of its windows, a pretty girl bent over a flower pot of alpine violets. Look, she tilted her head just so, a little flirtatious, smiling faintly, her eyes a bright, impossible blue. She vanished. But a moment later, she reappeared, as if drifting back from the clouds. Now she fed pigeons whose tails spread into greenish fans, and laughed to herself with careless delight. Hyppolite was satisfied with his new lodgings. Somewhere in the third house down, someone played each evening, softly, wistfully, on an old whispering spinet. It didn't so much sing as sigh, and always the same tune, one and always the same. It began, "Twilight promises golden stars." Before long, Hyppolite was noticed from the windows across the alley. Pale, almost chalk white, a long drooping nose, eyes black, searching still, hair as dark as Japanese lacquer, parted down the centre by a white streak. He stood at the window as though searching for something, yearning, waiting. One evening, its twilight thick and dim, like dusk behind a veil of cypresses, Hyppolite noticed a new shadow in one of the opposite windows in a different apartment than before. It flickered enchantingly in the nearness of the light, then disappeared into the deep black smudge of the background, as if behind a curtain. It was something too beautiful, too startling to bear. Hyppolite stood and waited. The next day, the shadow finally took form. A girl approached the window, unknown until now, with narrow, almond-shaped eyes, and long, flowing hair braided into plaits the colour of old gold. Her gaze drifted toward Hyppolite and lingered. That one look was enough. In it, they understood everything. They had been waiting for each other all along. Clouds rushed across the rooftops overhead, and the two of them stared at one another, entranced as if spellbound. Hyppolite came to himself, placed a vase of narcissi on the windowsill, and bowed to the girl across the street as though greeting her at a ballroom waltz. She smiled, raised a hand in reply, and so they were introduced, whimsically and in some curious way, bound together. She wore the most exquisite robes, fine silken garments that flowed like water, full of folds and sensuous lines. And she looked toward Hyppolite as if calling him with her eyes. Once he saw her in the street, accompanied by a matron of dignified bearing. A golden carriage clattered past, carrying the archbishop from the palace to the white royal castle. Crowds of old women and curious children swayed in its wake, as if they were the trailing train of the noble procession. And there, somewhere near the gate of the castle, beneath the great stone giants locked in their eternal struggle, stood she, smiling, silent, and impossibly near. Hyppolite thought how strange it would be, how unbearable if he were to speak, or if she were to speak. Could he survive the touch of her hand? Of her lips? Her distant gaze unsettled him utterly, its wordless confession too naked, too unguarded. He bowed with courtly grace, then turned and descended toward his home, his faithful, beloved mistress. Ah, the terrible spasms of pleasure she gave him! She would sit in her chair, holding fast to the heavy Indian drapery, gazing at him with utter surrender, then offering him her lips. Her lips gleamed with blood, like precious gems, and Hyppolite could feel their wetness, their passion, radiating toward him through the blue, shimmering air. A strange, almost comical idea occurred to him, to write his confession to her, not on paper but on the glass pane, or better yet, into the air itself, traced with his finger. Words, after all. Words he had once dismissed, scorned, laughing at them as needless, inadequate. And yet he wrote, "I searched for you and found you. I love you, star of my life's twilight." She answered in gentle, very slow handwriting on the glass, "My chosen one." He straightened, overwhelmed by joy, and placed his hand over his heart. Then wrote, "My name is Hyppolite, and yours, Irina." "Irina," he whispered, closing his eyes in a rapture of dizziness, and wrote with an expression of purest bliss, Mysterious joy, I touch you, and I receive the radiance of your lips, your eyes, your breasts. After each word, a pause filled with gestures of passion. Irina replied with a certain solemnity, I wish to be your eternal light. Source of my life, Irina, my heart confesses itself to you and gives itself wholly. I hear its song, Hypolite, I understand and I accept. I merge with you in the rapture of supraconscious delight. We are one now, mysteriously inseparable, in life and in death. A long dash filled with ecstasy. He vanished from the window, and the girl, half faint, lay draped across her chaise longue. Her gown of grey satin, patterned with pink carnations, trailed listlessly across the floor, and her hair shimmered with that strange golden light. Somewhere neighbours stood at their windows, watching Hypolite. Elsewhere others peered at the beautiful lady across the way. And they were thoroughly entertained. Birds flew to the ledges, twigs in their beaks, and laughed mischievously. Clouds drifted past with smiles painted on their white wings. Even the stone maidens on the facades of the two opposite houses had changed position. Their lips stretched into laughter, their eyes glanced this way and that, their gestures suddenly very playful. And so Hypolite and Irina made love through the air, trembling with longing, glowing with rapture, dying in spasms of delight, and they were truly happy. He stood at the window, writing on the glass, writing with virtuosic speed, and received answers that burned with fervour. The trees were blooming and birds were building their nests. Irina wrote, I want to be with you always. Everything else has lost its hold on me. I shall not go outside again. And one white morning, she had her bed moved closer to the window. With strange delight, she lay down upon it and did not rise again. The bed was made of golden rods, all lace and embroidery and ribbon. And there she lay, like a saint in the rapture of love. Hypolite, swept up in mounting exaltation, grew paler and more transparent by the day. He too no longer left his home. Hour after hour he stood at the window, writing in the air, shaking his head, sending kisses, lighting little green, red and blue lamps in the shadows of his room, filling vases again and again with fresh flowers, kneeling for long stretches at the open window, like a penitent before an altar. And when he smiled, his thin lips revealed 2 rows of great white teeth, so that he resembled a living skeleton. Irina's face was pale, sweetly ravaged, and her smile was radiant, full of enchanted promises. She gave herself to him with a passion like a drifting cloud of wind, like a seashell surrendering to the immensity of the sea. I am dying, she once wrote at dusk, tracing the words with a thin, pale finger. Then I shall die with you, Hypolite replied. He brought red roses and placed them on the windowsill. He kissed them, then raised his head again. Yes, thank you, she answered. I drink in their scent, and with it your kisses. I want your lips. Kiss me, she answered. He narrowed his eyes and received her lips across the distance. The neighbour women laughed and laughed. They were as amused as if at the theatre. But had they been in the theatre, perhaps, they would have wept. At home, they laughed. And that, perhaps, was the luxury of private pleasure. Sparrows shrieked. The sun slipped intrusively into every crack and corner of every room. The scent of flowers from the opposite windows mingled in the air. Clouds flew quickly overhead, and through the towers drifted solemn songs. Hypolite and Irina saw no one but each other. But there was a quiet, sombre student who lived high above them in a garret room beneath the eaves. He saw them both, Hypolite in one window, Irina in the other, and beyond them many towers, the river and the blossoming hillsides. He said to himself seriously, this is how every person ought to live, even if it's a farce or a tragedy. Let it be lived fully, unashamed. Let there be no windows or doors, no nosy cracks, no dead walls haunted by peering eyes and listening ears. He was a deeply romantic young man. Irina grew paler and paler with each passing day. At times, someone would draw the curtains, and the beautiful Irina vanished, like the moon disappearing behind clouds. But then the curtains would part again, and Hypolite, faithfully waiting, would see his beloved once more. One evening, his arms, aching with longing, stretched far across the air, but still they could not reach the window opposite. It was night. What a night it was! Even colours became visible in its white clarity. The castle gleamed as though carved from marble, and the distinct towers, silver bright, rose upward toward the mysterious wisdom of space. Across the heights and in the depths of the city, scattered lights shimmered, casting long, shifting beams. Irina was once more alone in her room. Hyppolite gazed at her and kept gazing, as though he were fusing into her with his eyes. Her eyes were open. She raised her hand to him, a gesture like farewell, but she did not lift her head. She did not smile as she once had. Hyppolite leaned out from the window, throwing red roses into the translucent dark. But Irina remained strangely still, terribly still. The light beside her head glowed blue, bringing closer to Hyppolite her wide, unmoving eyes. So still, so unblinking, fixed on him with terrible determination. With a cry, Hyppolite collapsed to the floor, overcome by a dreadful seizure of love, and for a long, long time he did not awaken. When he came to, he saw something he had not expected. The room opposite was draped in black, and Irina lay by the window, cold, white, so white, in a glass coffin. Great green emeralds shone on her chest, and her golden hair spilled in scattered brilliance across the satin of her shroud. What miraculous beauty! Like a vision obscured by sea foam, she slept beneath the glass lid of her coffin. He leaned out from the window and stared, stunned, at his dead beloved. The neighbour women were watching too, and they were deeply astonished. The air was filled with sunlight by day and with moonlight by night. Hyppolite placed a great wreath of blooming passion flowers on the windowsill and lit a yellow wax candle inside, the one that had once burned beside the head of his departed mother, now crowned with a garland of forget-me-nots. Soft, barely audible songs drifted through the air, so faint they left no echo, and the funeral bells descended like night moths from the nearby towers, and Hyppolite stood utterly still, gazing in stunned silence toward his dead beloved. The moon shone very brightly. Pale and cold, Hyppolite climbed out the window, driven by an irrepressible longing. He seated himself on the wide stone ledge, beside a grey, weathered statue, an old figure with its arm outstretched toward the house across the way. Ah, how close he was now to his beloved, and how the statues seemed to feel with him. The chill of the night brushed over him, and the silver light of the moon bathed his body. He leaned against the grey protrusions, stretched his head forward as far as he could, to bring himself even closer to the one who lay dead across the way. And there, in that pose of absolute surrender to stillness, a pose already embodied by his dear, lifeless Irina in the room opposite, he was seen through the window by the solemn boy above, in the little turret room. The student watched, astonished, long, unable to comprehend it, that state beyond the world, beyond life, until the light began to shift and white mists like veils fell into the grass. The clock struck. Somewhere a bell sounded once and fell silent. And when the grey dawn broke, the student upstairs realised with awe that a new statue had appeared on the old Baroque house by the garden. A statue, truly a statue, as if the sorrow of love had turned itself into stone. He hurried down in wonder and examined the new white figure, and easily he recognised the man, that familiar figure, now turned to stone with an expression of immense love, a hand pressed to his heart, his gaze forever fixed upon the open window where his beloved lay, surrounded by flickering candles in her glass coffin. Morning had come, and the neighbour women had risen too. From all along the street they gathered to witness the miracle. The petrified lover, the one who had once amused them so in life. There was much gossip, much discussion, but one thing was certain. The pale Hyppolite had turned to stone, and to this day he still sits there, hand on heart, head lifted into the blue air, on the ledge of the old house above the quiet almond orchard. Irina was long since buried, beneath a granite gravestone where the wreaths of lilies often wither, and Hyppolite, transformed into stone, still gazes, in the pose of a devoted lover, into the unreachable chamber of love, long since abandoned. And the lovers who wander beneath the blossoming branches of the orchard still like to point out the old statue softened by moss and smile at it with a sadness that is almost sweet.